when you look back into religion, you have to assume that, all right, the religious interface is almost like a story or a worldview or a vision or a user interface that we paint over our psychology in the world. It's a sort of unified thing. It's a very, very functional way of using the mind, And what you start to notice is that there's a lot of phenomenon that begin to hint towards this idea, especially in the idea of like magic spirits and whatnot. Because an outside force appearing to you now is a kind of scary thing, of course. It's like, oh my God, I'm going insane. And you talk to a lot of people going through psychosis, and it often has very religious themes, which is kind of eerie in and of itself. But you look into the past and you look at things that were perfectly normal and easier for people to integrate, were things like, for example, the Holy Spirit coming to talk to me, or a demon appearing in my mind. A demon appearing to me. Do you know that type of idea? Like it's appearing in your phenomenological reality like a spirit. It's not like walking into your room. It's appearing in your like dimension or something like that. Now that's a very, very, very strange and eerie way of thinking, but it's how these people thought, and they treated it as a extremely real thing that can happen, whereas we see it as ridiculous and superstitious. Okay, but these people made it through harder times than us, so there must have been something right about it. You look back at Homer, and he talks about the idea of the muse, the sacred muse, who sings to me about the rage of Achilles. It's like, what are you on about, Homer? You're the dude who makes the books, You're just write. Just shut up talking about fucking women, and just write. Just write. But instead, no, he sees it as so important for his masterwork that he has to ask some outside force to come and help him. A feminine outside force, maybe that sits on his shoulder. In the Iliad itself, you have this moment where Achilles, the angry, egotistical dopamine return to monkey left brain, the Achilles wants to fight Agamemnon because Agamemnon has insulted him, and right at the moment where he wants to pull out his sword and do it, a feminine spirit reaches down and grabs his hair and pulls him back and says, hold on, wait for the future, don't do this, stop for a second. And this is like the guardian, the guiding force of some sort. And then, of course, you see this all over the place in history. The more you look, as I said, you see stuff like the muses and whatnot, and guardian angels and all these type of things. And it's very reductive to put it all down to like the right hemisphere. I'm not suggesting that at all. But it starts to fit in an uncomfortable way. Now, we have a very, very interesting question when it comes to Jung, because Jung's anima fits this model and makes us scratch the noggin to wonder what's going on. And of course, Jung was at a very precarious point in history because he was right in the middle of that period where our interface had changed to the dead rationalistic way of seeing things. And what was the theme of the Red Book? In that he meets this anima and this unconscious, and he is scared because he believes he's going psychotic. The thing that is happening to him is the great problem of the interface. My hardware is broken. There's something wrong with me. I'm damaged. I'm dangerous in all this. And there's a possibility that he was rediscovering something that people knew quite intuitively in their interfaces in the past. Now, the psychology movement appeared at a very, very important period in history because it was right as this old interface was completely disintegrating, which Nietzsche called the death of God. It was completely falling apart and people couldn't interact with their minds anymore. There was kind of craziness going on. People couldn't take Christianity serious. They were very, very much struggling with this. Now, of course, psychology becomes more interesting when you start to look at the archetypes that appear in it. In the Christian church, in the Catholic Church, you would go into confession, you would sit down, you would let all this stuff off your chest, and a priest, a learned elder, would sit down and hear all the stuff you're saying, and then they'd offer you some reorganizations of your mind, some magic jargon that would correct your mind for you, and that would allow you to get all that stuff out of you, get the demons out, cast the demons out, and then get this correct stuff that puts you in, that's good energy, and then you go off in your merry way and you feel better because you got it out of you and you got corrected. Now, that's so similar to the psychoanalytic couch where you lie down, you literally let stuff out of you, you radically, honestly confess what is going on, and then the analyst sits down and they try to rearrange and correct and add the correct jargon and put the correct spell and name the demons that are living inside you and treat you the magic spells in order to fix that. It's a very, very similar pattern, which is quite fascinating. But of course, it does make sense, because with the struggle that these gentlemen like Freud and Jung were having is that, as I said, this new interface there was a need for a new interface. Everybody instinctively knows that we need an interface to interact with our minds more than we need stuff like neuroscience and hardware and whatnot. But of course, these guys didn't have neuroscience and hardware. They're almost like in a bridge point. We have all the hardware understood now, but they didn't. They were sort of in the middle. They had to do something. And so they began to try to figure out a logic of the soul. Psychology is soul logic, okay? And what sort of comes up from this is the vision of what is happening in the mind and what are the forces active in the mind. Now, again, we've already talked about this plenty. You have these two dynamic forces coming from the hardware. But these guys didn't know that, okay? And actually, the era of their day was that we've got this one rational perspective. You can think about the idea of genius. How do you create something genius? You sit down and you think about it and you make it really, really good, and then you present it. That's sort of even the 19th century idea. It was a work of genius. Napoleon did his magic fighting because he was a genius. He rationally thought through what he was doing. Scientists like Newton, they figured out what was going on. There's obviously a disregard for Newton's alchemical studies and whatnot. And Beethoven and all that. It's like the work of genius. It's the articulate, created work of genius. And it's this unipolar vision of the mind, the rationalist 19th century. Now, of course, these guys, and Freud in particular, and Nietzsche did this quite a lot as well, and Nietzsche himself, even, if you will, broke with this. Jung noticed this too. He looked at Nietzsche's Zarathustra and he said, it's very, very strange how Nietzsche was able to allow an outside force known as Zarathustra to enter his body and possess him and speak through him. That's a very, very, very difficult thing for someone to do in the 19th century. That's not normal. That's madness. And Nietzsche ended up going mad, which I guess is you win some, you lose some in some sense. And so Nietzsche was letting this Zarathustra inside of him, and that's like a heresy on the interface of the day, or the way of seeing the world at the day. But it's actually closer to how the hardware should work. Because when you talk to a modern artist, or even you look at something like how modern art works, it definitely looks like in these moments of inspiration, we have the locking of the two hemispheres together, and it's almost like they start talking to each other, whereas normally they're, as we said, inhibited. They call this hemisync and various different things, but we won't get into that too much. Freud and Jung appeared in this moment where they're trying to figure out a logic of the soul, a logic of the mind, a way that we can orchestrate and put together something that kind of makes sense. And of course, if you're going to study this stuff in any way seriously, you're going to start to come across this idea of two forces, and probably more, but we'll just go with two for simplicity's sake. What you start to notice very, very early on is that you'll have this rational, talking left hemisphere ego. You'll have this talking mind that the Buddhists notice. They call it the monkey mind. And it's usually delusional. It's usually a bit of a liar, and it usually doesn't really know what's going on. Now, we've seen this in studies with the left hemisphere. If you cut the two brains in half and have the right hemisphere move stuff around with the hand, the left hemisphere, even though it's completely not moving what's going on, it will make up all these silly excuses and rationalizations to protect itself from the reality. It's a rationalized story maker. It's very, very fascinating in that sense. And this looks so much like the problem with the ego. The ego is like a ego defense mechanism. It's a bullshit. It's a bullshitter, basically. And then there's this other force, this driving force, which is this unconscious. This unconscious has a lot of stuff within it. I can't make it simple, but I'm just going to brush over quite a lot of it. But you have this force of sexual id, instinctive id running up from underneath it, and then you have the articulate superego and whatnot. But nonetheless, it sort of boils down into this ego versus this unconscious in whatever way it manifests. And so there's a great amount of tension between these two forces. And so Freud's not scientifically accurate or anything like that. He doesn't have any studies to back him up. But what he does have is he has some pretty good observations, and he was pretty spot on. Nowadays we say, it's very common for us to say something like the subconscious. But that was sort of like one of his things to figure out, and it was sort of the part of the zeitgeist he was a part of.